I think we've taken a lot of your time. I just want to end on two points. One, can you first describe your you recently went on a trip to Japan, and there was like obviously Japan is very Buddhist and Shinto and mixture of a lot of different things, but there's these elements of Indianness and Hinduness that still run kind of through the culture. Can you first talk about that, and then lastly we'll end on like what your future projects are, plus your work at DANAM.
Okay, wonderful. So you've touched on a really fascinating topic, and it's one that my wife and I both have taken a great interest in, and we might even at some point do some kind of joint scholarship on. Her area is Japan,
Okay.
and mine, of course, is India. And I'll be a little bit autobiographical. So my wife has studied Japan and Japanese and been going to Japan for a very, very long time. And the first time she brought me to Japan with her, she knows me very well, so she set up this wonderful itinerary. And we went to Buddhist monasteries. We spent several days at the head monastery of the Shingon system of Buddhism. It's at a place called Mount Koya, Koyasan, south of Kyoto and Osaka, and way up on a mountain. You have to take this really scary cable car to get to the top, and so we're there with these monks. And Shingon is a tantric form of Buddhism. And the founder of that tradition, his name was Kukai, and he's better known now as Kobo Daishi. He was a Japanese monk who lived in around the 8th century, and he traveled to China, and his search was for authentic Buddhism. And he was aware that Buddhism had not really come from China. It had come to Japan via China and Korea, but it was really an Indian tradition. And he actually encountered, there's debate about whether he encountered actual Indian Buddhist monks or monks who had been trained by Indian Buddhist monks. But he learned Sanskrit, and according to popular belief, he created one of the 3 Japanese alphabets that are currently used to write the Japanese language. They use Chinese characters, which they call kanji. There's another system called hiragana, which is syllabic. And if you know Devanagari, it's clearly based on the same kind of syllabic system.
Wow.
And he developed it in order to be able to translate the Tantric Buddhist texts directly from Sanskrit to Japanese without the medium of Chinese, because he realized that the Chinese medium changed the meaning of terms. So, we see this all the time when we try to translate Sanskrit terms into English, right? You say dukkha is suffering, but then you have all kinds of misconceptions about what Buddhism is teaching and so on. So he brought this tradition back to Japan, along with a mandala and a lot of Buddhist imagery. And if you go through Mount Koya, and then after that experience, go to various Buddhist temples across Japan, it strikes you how Indian it is. And in fact, many Japanese people themselves are not aware of how deeply Indian Buddhism is, and a lot of the imagery that they use. Funny story, when we were in Mount Koya, there's a cemetery there where monks their ashes have been interred for many centuries. And there's this pillar that has Devanagari writing on it. And I could read it, my wife could read it, I mean, anyone who knows Hindi could read it. And we overheard a tour guide talking to people about the cemetery. And someone asked, what is that writing? Because it's very clearly not Japanese or Chinese. And he said, this is Buddhist magical writing. So, and my wife and I are shaking our heads thinking, we can read that. It's Devanagari. Now, he wasn't entirely wrong, because it was a series of bija mantras. So okay. That is Buddhist magical writing. But yeah, I mean, it's not some script that came down from heaven. It's an Indian script. And so if you know what to look for, you see that Japan is full of Indian cultural influence, religious influence. You go to my favorite Japanese temple in Kyoto, Sanju Sangendo. There's 1,001 manifestations of Avalokiteshvara.
Yes, I've been to that one.
You've been there, yeah. They call Avalokiteshvara Kannon in Japan, from Kuan Yin in Chinese. And the guardian deities that surround they're all from the Vedas. You've got Rudra, and you've got Vishnu and Lakshmi and Brahma. They're all
Indra too, yeah.
Indra with Japanese names and facial features, but they're clearly Hindu gods. And so I think that Hinduism, or what we now call Hinduism, traveled with Buddhism across Asia all the way to Japan. and has become almost this kind of open secret. That is, I don't know how many. I mean, Japanese people know. The average person knows that Buddhism came from India, but it pretty much stops there.
Right.
But just how much? I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of Indic imagery that infuses Japanese temples, and even the Japanese way of life. I mean, a lot of it is Confucian. A lot of it came from China, but there's something very dharmic, I feel, about the way people make room for each other on a subway, or you think about the other person first. You pour water for the other person before you would pour for yourself. And then, I mean, some of this has even been lost in India, right?
Oh,
So
totally lost.
Yeah.
The chaos that is India.
Exactly. And I think that and we have all these stereotypes of India chaotic, Japanese ordered, India developing, Japanese hypermodern, so that we don't think to look for India in Japan.
That's
but
right.
I think it's very much there, and I think this is one of those cultural awakenings that could really. I mean, I could see it benefiting people from both heritages. Sort of understanding this, kind of bond, because if India and Japan, if we insist on putting them on sort of a spectrum where they're the radical other of one another, then there's less possibility of communication. But
Right.
no, I think that there's a lot in Japan that is Indian, that has been preserved, that India could reclaim. And I think people in Japan, by being aware of that Indic inheritance, well, I mean, I think that would militate against some of the xenophobia you see in Japanese society. The Japanese are like everybody else. It's like, oh, our society's the best, we're unique, we're different. But it's like everybody. We've all been interacting all through time, and so I think it's a really important topic, and I'm glad you asked about it.
So what I find interesting is in terms of both people's understanding of what Hinduism and Buddhism is I think people think that they were separate for so long, but like what we recognize is actually like many people like were Buddhists in philosophy, but in their practice were very Hindu, right?
Yeah.
So and that's through time, and I think recently it's changed, but I think for most of history that was of nature, like the religion of ritual and practice, and maybe even some of the gods and all this was very much integrated with the Buddhist ideas. Yeah. And they would kind of just travel together because they hadn't separated into Buddhism versus Hinduism versus, they were all part of this like weird conglomerate of ideas that kind of moved together in like clocks.
And very holistically, you look at Angkor Wat and it's got temples to Vishnu, Shiva, and Buddha. And of course, if you look at Japan, what do most people do? They'll have a Shinto wedding and a Buddhist funeral. Well, that's because there's not a Buddhist wedding, right? Buddhism is an ascetic tradition. We don't have. So what did Indian Buddhists do? Well, they had Vedic weddings. They did all of these things. And it's also so interesting to see that many of the great Buddhist philosophers were Brahmins. They were trained in the Vedic tradition. This is one of the reasons why Buddhist texts started to be written in Sanskrit. Well, that's what the scholars knew, because they'd grown up in that sort of tradition of punditry, and they knew the Sanskrit texts and knew the language, and it was very natural to write in Sanskrit. And Absolutely. So, I think the two are so interwoven. And if you look at places like Nepal, for example, that was sort of more on the margin of South Asia, and it didn't suffer as much from the invasions and so forth that happened through the centuries. There you see Buddhism and Hinduism really pretty nicely integrated, or again, maybe integration isn't even the right word because it presupposes two separate things.
Yeah, that's right.
They were always sort of organically interconnected.
Yeah. Hey, Racchit, I know you have some things on your mind.
No, this is actually brilliant, Professor Long. You pretty much hit upon everything I was going to ask you. So I was going to bring up Kobodaishi, and the Shingon Buddhism and its real connection with Hinduism. And so it's brilliant that you talked about that, and also the intertwined nature of Hinduism and Buddhism, and how both of them have traveled together. That Buddhism, very rightly, as he said, presupposes Hinduism. Most of the social practices were Hindu. In Southeast Asia and Thailand too, right? There's so much influence of the basic Vedic Dharma. I mean, I've heard until recently, in fact, they followed the traditional Dharma Shastras in terms of, the model of kingship and the rights of actually anointing.
They just had the kingship, Racchit. They did it in a Hindu ceremony.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. So that's really brilliant. And I think, in fact, it was Dr. Subhash Kak also wrote about this a little recently, right, about the traveling of Hinduism through Central Asia, most, in I think the Khotan province, right, that was out there in like Kashgar. And so it's really brilliant that most of these connections have been lost, and I think the traditional model was that the Hinduism, because of Brahmins sort of being more orthodox, were inward looking, the Buddhists who went out. But I think really, yes, it was indeed the Buddhists who went out, but they took so much of this overall Indian, I wouldn't even just say Hindu, because again, we're differentiating the Hindu and Buddhist faith, Indic culture with them, and spread it, all the way to, the extreme of East Asia.
That's right. No, exactly. I think this is an important thing to recover too. And I find that, so often in the Western world, people want to contrast Hinduism and Buddhism. And very often it issues in a dialogue or a discourse where Hinduism comes off very badly. It's the tradition that needed to be reformed by the Buddha. Everything was terrible, and then the Buddha came, and it all got better. And that's really projecting a whole lot of contemporary biases and misunderstandings back in where they just did not exist. And I occasionally dabble in the website, Quora.com. People ask all kinds of questions, and it can become a black hole of time. I don't answer most of the questions I get, but every now and then I like to answer questions. And someone recently asked a question. I haven't written anything yet, but is Buddhism progressive or conservative? And the question is such a projection of the contemporary world onto just a very different time and place and culture. So I'm gonna, if I answer that, it's gonna be this very Syadvada answer that it's both, it's neither, it's all of these things.
Professor Long, the one more question to add, I totally forgot about this, but I've actually heard that the Shingans have actually kept a version of the Homa still alive.
Yes. In fact, they call it Goma, and it's performed in it's a very sort of Japanese inflected Sanskrit, but it's quite recognizably a Vedic Homa.
Wow.
And who do they do it to? Is it do they do it to a deity, or is it just like?
Well, it's an old tantric ritual, and in fact, probably tantric Buddhists in India itself were doing the Homa in a tantric context. And so there's series of deities that are, again, a blend of deities that you can find in the Vedas with some deities that are distinctively Buddhist. And then you get to what would be regarded as the high deities, and those are the bodhisattvas and Buddhas of Mahayana Buddhism. And so it's connected with their practice of the mandala. So the mandala is really the central thing in Shingon. And the central deity there is the Vairochana, the universal consciousness, who, by all accounts, sounds like Brahman. He's a universal consciousness that we're all part of. And so there's this kind of ascent through the mandala, through the different stages, and the Goma, the bija mantras used in the Goma correspond to, they map onto the mandala. So it's the mandala put into the form of a ritual. It's like you could say it's the spatial representation put into the form of a temporal set of actions,
which they do in Tantra very, very often, right?
Exactly.
So the Sri Chakra and all that stuff is in the Bindu, and bring all that in. So it's actually funny. Racchit and I spend a lot of time. We talk about like the nature of now I forgot. No, it just slipped my mind. I was about to on the topic you just brought in about actually this how the Tathagata in Buddhism is very much like Brahman in Vedanta, but how they, despite the fact that they say it's not, it's almost the same qualities, the same interaction. I mean, this same.
I think so too.
Metaphysical nature.
Well, and here's where I get in trouble with Buddhism scholars, but I was very happy to see a book about this. I'm forgetting the name of the author, but there's a book called How Buddhism Found a Soul in East Asia. And if you go back to Steve Collins' work on Theravada Buddhism, selfless persons, he makes a very provocative statement that the Anatman doctrine, the Anatta doctrine, he calls it a linguistic taboo, that the Buddhists differentiated themselves from everyone else by not using the term self. And of course, there's a whole set of principled reasons why they don't use the term self. But once Buddhism gets out of India, and its interlocutors are no longer Brahmins who are talking about Atman all the time, they become much more relaxed about it. And I've talked to Zen Buddhists who talk about how everything is one. In Satori, you're awakening to your own original nature, and they'll even say to your true self. And I'm like, self? Wow, you're not supposed to say that, right? But it's so a lot of it came from this polemic that we've referenced earlier in the conversation, where Buddhists were staking out a position where we're not you, right? We're not Vedanta. We are, and of course, in Vedanta, like you say, it likes to have everything both ways. It likes to kind of absorb other traditions. I mean, Ramakrishna is a great example of that.
Yeah.
And I find a lot of contemporary Buddhists, even a lot of Western Buddhists saying, no, we're different. We're not
Right.
you guys. And I can respect that. I mean, on the Hindu side, we get accused of colonizing everybody all the time. Oh, we're absorbing all of your ideas and so on. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it, again, to kind of reference some things we've said earlier, that there is an objective nature of reality.
Yeah.
If it involves this infinite ocean of consciousness that is our true nature, and if our ultimate aim in this life is to realize and manifest that, call it Brahman, call it Buddha nature,
Exactly.
call it the mystical body of Christ. All these things will have different implications, and call it the Tao. We don't want to just mush everything together indiscriminately, but if our basic premise is that there is a real something,
Yeah.
that all of these are attempts to describe, then I don't see it as being such a problem. I think it becomes two things. Of course, there's tribalism.
Right.
Oh, we're different from you, so yeah, okay, we don't want to step on anyone's toes. And then, of course, in scholarship, it's like, well, you don't want to appear as if you don't know the difference between Vedanta and Buddhism. I mean, then people don't take you seriously. But beyond all of that, I really think we're all talking about just reality, and
Yeah.
we're all in it. We're all part of it. And again, this is really brought home for me in Japan because again, they're away from all of the Indian arguments. If you go to a place called Nara, there's a old temple called Todaiji. It's massive. There's a giant Buddha in that temple. He's even bigger than the famous Daibutsu at Kamakura, who's outdoors. And you really feel that you're in the presence of the infinite when you're in front of that deity. He's massive, massive Buddha. He's Vairochana, again, the cosmic Buddha. And I tried repeatedly, and it was really a funny experiment. I probably took about 20 photos with my cell phone of this image, trying to convey its immensity. And you just can't. You have to be there and experience it and be in the presence of it, because it's so beautifully proportioned that if you take a picture of it, unless there's a person standing near it, it could be sitting on someone's shelf. I mean, it's just it's this nicely proportioned Buddha image. But if you're there, it's so massive and so immense.
But I think that story you're saying right now is perfect analogy of how we all talk about the world, or this universal entity. If you're not in it, all we get are these snapshots from these various locations that don't capture it.
That don't capture it. And by the end of that, I was realizing this. I had this very profound realization. It's like, yeah, all these photos I'm trying to take are like our various attempts to grasp.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we've taken a lot of your time. Racchit did have some questions as to DANAM that I think he wanted to ask. So please.
Absolutely.
Oh, no. There's nothing specific, Professor Long. I just want to understand, how and why was DANAM conceived? What work you've done in the past, where you are today, and where your mission is leading you in the future, and how that's relevant to the broader community.
Okay, very good. So DANAM is really the brainchild of, to a very great extent, I would say, several people, but the main person I would give credit to is Rita Sharma, who teaches at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley currently, and very good friend of mine. And she developed DANAM around the year 2000. I was not yet involved at that time, but I remember I was just getting started in the academy at that point. I finished my PhD in 2000. I'd gotten my job at Elizabethtown College, and I wanted to connect with like-minded scholars. And I was just browsing the web one day, and I came across the DANAM website, and it was, all these lights went off. I was like, this is it. Because what DANAM was in its origins and what it's continued to be is it's an attempt to be a site where conversations kind of like the ones we're having or like are in my Reincarnation volume, by people who are both scholars with academic credentials and all of the training of the academy, but who also have some rooting in one of these traditions as a way of life, can reflect on philosophical questions and theological and ethical kinds of questions. What Rita found, and I still see this to be the case, and again, this type of scholarship is fine, and I think it's important and has a place, but overwhelmingly, the scholarship on Hinduism is descriptive, and really seems to operate from a premise that, it's the tradition of those people, right? There's this assumed gaze that is still very Western and detached, secular in its outlook, and so on. And if you go to the American Academy of Religion website and you look at all the different panels that occur at the AAR annual meeting, you'll find tons of things on Christian theology. They have panels dedicated to just one particular theologian, right? I mean, there's that just looks at the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? There's an Aquinas group. There are people who do liberation theology. There are people who do feminist theology. There are people who do queer theology. Mm-hmm. And you look at that and you think, where's the Hindu equivalent of that? Where's the group dedicated to talking about Shankara and the relevance of Shankara's thought in the contemporary world? Where's the Ramanuja group that's not just looking at Ramanuja as an historical figure, but looking at bringing Ramanuja's thought into conversation with contemporary trends? Where is that? So DANAM is an attempt to be that. And another thing that DANAM is trying to do is to extend the discourse. It's not a purely Hindu-based organization, but it's also been trying to advance this terminology of Dharma Traditions, which the idea is that it's really kind of a parallel or an analog with the idea of Abrahamic traditions, right? So this is something that's very well known in the Western world. You have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're historically related. They share a lot of terminology, a lot of geography, a lot of history. Well, so do Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. Sikhism is a little controversial. I think there have been Sikhs who've seen this as an attempt to try to, again, sort of colonize Sikhism or swallow up Sikhism. And of course, Sikhism has a very deep connection with Abrahamic traditions as well. So maybe we can think of the Sikh tradition as kind of a bridge between these two families or groups. But certainly Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism share vocabulary, assumptions, practices, just, a vast range. And, the attempt to think through contemporary issues, ethical problems, philosophical issues from a Hindu point of view, from a Buddhist point of view, from a Jain point of view. And of course, being aware that there are many Hindu points of view and many Buddhist points of view and so on. But that kind of nuanced conversation that you see among the Christian theologians, we want that as Hindu thinkers, as Buddhist thinkers, as Jain thinkers, as scholar practitioners. I think it was a little controversial in the beginning because I think there were some folks who tried to co-opt DANAM for their own particular agenda of how they thought the insider-outsider discourse should happen. And we sort of tightened that up by basically insisting that if you're going to present, you need to have academic credentials, right? These are scholar practitioners, not just a soapbox for anyone with an opinion. And as a result, it's really become very respectable so that major scholars, again, like Jerry Larson, like Frank Clooney, a lot of people from across the academy have now presented on a DANAM panel or have attended our events and meetings. I was very heavily involved at one point. I was the chair of the steering committee. I've stepped back a little just because I'm busy, but I still think the work is very important. But what I'm very happy to see is now there's a younger generation of scholars taking over. And we've got people on the steering committee now that, just got their PhDs within the last 5 to 10 years. And they're advancing the conversation and it's continuing. So I'm in this funny position. I don't think of myself as that old, but I guess I'm one of the sort of elder statesmen now of DANAM. I go to the meetings. I'm going to be on a panel at the upcoming AAR at our DANAM. I mean, we have one on artificial intelligence. And how could that be conceptualized in the Dharma traditions? So that's what we mean by. I mean, that's certainly a contemporary issue. That's a cutting edge issue. Yeah, and I'm going to be bringing in some strange material. I'm going to be juxtaposing Star Trek and Marie Kondo in my talk. So if you're at the AR, come and hear how basically talking about how the question, is something conscious, often seems to boil down to how are we allowed to treat that entity?
Right.
So in other words, can we abuse it? Can we hurt it? Can we exploit it? Can we eat it? And I'm going to be arguing that both in Jainism and in also, if you look at Vedanta and Buddhism to some extent, you have an ethos that asks, why should we treat anything, even what we think of as an inanimate object, poorly, right? Isn't this just a manifestation of our own inner violence, our own kleshas? Shouldn't we be cultivating the habit of showing respect even to the objects in the room? And then how much more will we respect the living beings that we encounter? And so that's a short summary of my next DANAM paper. But in terms of my future work, I've got a book coming out very shortly that I'm very excited about on Hinduism in America. And it's a place where I've found I've been able to talk about both the South Asian community and its fortunes and misfortunes, ups and downs, migrating into North America, and how that has shaped Hindu practice, but also how people like myself, people like Ram Dass Lam, people like George Harrison, how did we get involved in all of this? And so the subtitle is A Convergence of Worlds. So Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, the coming together of the Hindu diaspora community with non-Indians who are just drawn to all of this. And at the recommendation of one of the reviewers of the manuscript, I'm rewriting some of it now to pay more attention to the young generation of Hindus growing up in America who have grown up here. They're of Indian descent. They aren't from the sort of seeker community like people like me, but they also aren't the people who grew up in India and they have their own. So I want to have the perspective of. In fact, I should probably interview you for this book because I really am interested in because this was something I think I neglected in what I developed, because I know a lot of folks your age and your generation, and I think that's the future, right? That's what's coming next, and I think it's something I want to. So these are three worlds, really: your generation, your parents' generation, and then strangers like me. Yeah. So and because all of it is part. So it's interesting. I have gone to Hindu temples and seen the discourse being given by a Swami in an orange robe who's a white guy.
Yep.
And that's who the kids are learning from, and that's and so it is not exclusive to any one ethnic group, and yet it's also inescapably Indian, and that also is part of the reality that needs to be understood. So that's my next, and then I've got an introduction to Indian philosophy that is in the pipeline too. So
excellent.
Several things going on.
Well, if people want to reach out to you, Professor Long, how do they get in touch with you?
Probably the easiest way is email, and I can give my address. It's well, you have my email address too. I don't know if it'll be posted with the
I'll put it up.
But it's my last name, Long JD. So for Jeffrey David Long, so Long JD at etown.edu. That's my Elizabethtown College address. Easiest way to get in touch with me. And if I don't reply, it's probably because it got bounced by our college server. But I try to reply to everyone.
Do you have Twitter, any of that stuff?
I do Twitter and Facebook. In fact, we initially connected through Facebook.
Yeah.
I've pulled back from social media a bit just because of all the polarization we talked about earlier. So now I pretty much go on and wish people happy birthdays and announce my next, article or book coming out, and that's about it. But I can be connected with through Twitter and Facebook also.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time, Professor Long. I know it's been a long conversation, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think
I have. Well.
Absolutely.
And thank you for all your knowledge and hard work and bringing all the good, jnana to people that don't have it. So very much, thank you so much, sir.
You're very kind. I'm doing all this because I learn more every time I have a conversation like this, every time I engage with someone. I'm learning. This is part of my sadhana, so I'm grateful to you.
Thank you. So we will be posting this very short next week. But thank you for your time, and we'll speak again.
Okay. Thank you so
All right.
much.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.